The self has been a topic of debate in 19th-century studies, with essays in recent studies, such as Studies in the Literary Imagination and Heather Henderson's The Victorian Self, suggesting that reports of the self's demise were premature. Autobiography has become a convenient laboratory for measuring referentiality, but contemporary debates over autobiography are more like a battleground with no certitude. Paul Chioditi's collection of essays confronts this issue directly and highlights the widely divergent interests and approaches that draw scholars to study autobiography. Some are drawn to autobiography in search of a confirmation of individual identity and validation of an ideal of literature as a face-to-face meeting of discrete individuals, while others are drawn to the form for the opposite reason, wishing to expose the individualist ideology upon which autobiography depends. The debate over autobiography is fierce because each side has a great deal invested in their critical positions. Paul John Eakins' essay on the referential aesthetic of autobiography is a good example of the kind of conflict to which I am referring. It is a sophisticated attempt to recoup a privileged space for autobiography by focusing on a reader-based theory of referentiality. Eakins' complex position depends on the idea of the reader critic, endowing the autobiography with its particular referentiality. He takes a review essay by Jonathan Lusberg to task for failing to account for the role of the reader in what he, following June, would term an autobiographical pact, the world of the text and reader, who rapidly becomes a critic, is turned into a hall of mirrors. The text is self-referential, the reader is self-referential, and ultimately the critic is writing about himself. While some may find this state of affairs comforting, Eakins' specular reciprocity of the world of autobiography circles around undecidable terms that seem more claustrophobic than cozy. One is left wondering about the status of the author's instinctive knowledge of the reader, or the claim that a certain consciousness is intrinsic to autobiography. Eakins' terms depend upon a vocabulary of individual instinct that is unassailable within the set of assumptions that enable it to operate as a knowledge that is genetic rather than learned. By a gesture of false humility, Eakins becomes simply a reader, albeit a reader, who actually creates the text in writing about it. This cunning and complex essay could not have been written by a layman. Sydney Smith's Construing Truths in Lying Mouths, Truth-Telling in Women's Autobiography, deconstructs essentialist terms, such as truth, and poses questions about its status. She denaturalizes the term truth and challenges an essentialist reading of autobiography that erases the traces of social, cultural, linguistic, and psychological technologies of selfhood and gender. Smith turns truth into a multiple and conflicted category, mobilizing a feminist critique of its pretensions to universality and transcendence. Eakins' approach is troubling, as there has been much debate over the relationship between referentiality and the subject within feminist theory. In some respects, Eakins' insistence upon referentiality is a useful corrective to a position that would reduce all texts to a play of language with no political or social ramifications. However, the question of referentiality may be a red herring, as what seems at stake here is not the referent, but the individual self upon which autobiography depends. Jerome H. Buckley in John Stuart Mill's True Autobiography reads on liberty as Mill's most compelling representation of a strong authorial self, and argues that the text complements the autobiography. Marjorie Durham's The Rest of Newman's Apologia analyzes the use of language in Newman's autobiography in terms of Baroque influences on his writing. Avram Fleischman, in American Fragments, provides a disjunctive reading of American autobiography that suggests far more than it states. Fleischman's approach implicitly undermines the image of a unified, centered self, as much self-writing in America is fragmentarily presented. George Landau's history, his story, and stories in Graham Swift's Water, and opposes the notion of the autonomous self to broader ideas of history and narration. Landau's analysis of Water and aligns itself with studies of the interrelations of fiction and history, presenting in microcosm an analysis of the idea of history as it relates to individual life stories. Janice Carlyle's discussion of George Eliot's Mill on the Floss is closer in spirit to Smith's feminist reading of autobiography and explicitly rejects the separation of autobiography and fiction. Carlyle argues that 17T Mill on the Floss is autobiographical, not because of its fidelity to the known facts of Eliot's autobiography, but because of the mirror-like doubling, or self-duplication in the text. Linda H. Peterson's Female Autobiographer, Narrative Duplicity, explores the concept of duplicity, or lying in autobiographies, arguing that autobiographers self-consciously repress and distort the past in their narratives. Peterson complicates the truth-lying dichotomy by showing how women autobiographers like Mary Robinson had to use a particular form of doubling to negotiate the gendered categories within which they operate. For Robinson, this meant countering public images of herself as a fallen woman, linked to the sexual and immoral, with the maternal. Peterson links this issue in Robinson's text to Margaret Oliphant's autobiography and Mary Howitt's An Autobiography, which resonates with the current context of many parents, both male and female, constantly asking to sacrifice one aspect of their lives to the other, despite political rhetoric about the sanctity of the family. Peterson's article continues a meditation on the relationship of autobiography and gender, inaugurated in her book Victorian Autobiography, The Tradition of Self-Interpretation. This study covered much the same ground as Henderson's more recent The Victorian Self, but the differences between the two are striking. Henderson's study operates within a set of terms that seem largely uninformed, either by feminist or historical concerns. She examines the role of biblical imagery in the autobiographies of Newman, Ruskin, and Goss, and the fictional autobiographies David Copperfield and Jane Eyre. Her most valuable contribution, as George Landau points out on the book's dust cover, are in her chapters on Ruskin and Goss, arguing that Ruskin and Goss texts enact what amounts to an unconversion that reverses the usual narrative of conversion and spiritual progress. However, it is unclear how the other chapters help advance our knowledge of Victorian autobiography, particularly in light of Peterson's previous work. The discussion of autobiography in the Victorian self seems largely unaffected by any of the theoretical debates that inform the discussion of referentiality in Smith's and Eakin's essays. In Studies in the Literary Imagination, Henderson makes some insightful remarks on Victorian autobiography, but they are left largely undeveloped. The self has not disappeared from criticism of autobiography in the 1990s, as it has continued to be a central theme in the field. The existence of issues like Studies in the Literary Imagination and 17's Victorian self suggests that criticism in the 1980s was driven by deconstruction and feminism, but even some feminist criticism is informed and eventually subverted by individualist premises. Even contemporary theorists proclaim the death of the self, but it is resurrected in their polemics, much like religion-informed Goss' supposed liberation from his father's theology. Debates over the nature of the self may have the same status as theological controversies over how many angels would fit on the head of a pin. The battles fought in these debates have consequences mainly for individual careers and professional prestige. However, the Persian Gulf War played a significant role in transforming individualism and autobiography into an individualist ideology. The relationship between contemporary critical practices and political entities, such as the state, is complex and raises more hackles than the question of whether or not the self exists and whether it is unified, gendered, multiform, or racial. Essays like Linda Peterson's study of Mary Robinson show that the changing interests of critics reflect changing priorities in our own culture. Eakin is right to claim that criticism is to a large extent autobiographical, although the critic's position may reflect cultural more than individual change.